This is Invisible Inc., the podcast for under-resourced women entrepreneurs, and I'm your host, Shubha Chakravarti, founder of Achieve. Join me as I talk to women entrepreneurs about the nuts and bolts of their journeys and to experts who will give you insights that are hard to find anywhere else. Let's jump in. Why is it important for women to understand the view from the balcony and not just stay on the dance floor? What's a surprising barrier to entrepreneurship you never heard about? Why do you need to be extra vigilant as a woman with entrepreneurial ambitions? In this episode, Dr. Sameeksha Desai, Associate Professor and Director, Manufacturing Policy Initiative at Indiana University, talks about the iceberg problem of entrepreneurship, why the step before the first step is so critical and so overlooked for women, how women can push the odds in their own favor despite a challenging system, and much more. Now, here's Sameeksha. Good afternoon, Sameeksha. Thank you so much for being on Invisible Inc. We're so excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You've done an incredible amount of research on entrepreneurship, and especially entrepreneurship by gender and race. What got you interested in the first place?
I always thought of it as something where you have a business and therefore you must be interested in entrepreneurship. And I wasn't interested in starting a business or owning a business. It actually seemed like something that was very hard and not up my alley at all. But what I really cared about was advancement and economic resilience. And so I grew up in Asia. So I grew up in the Philippines. I spent a lot of time in countries where you would see the same cycle happen again and again. So in the Philippines, for example, in the late 70s and early 80s, we saw the cycle of economic instability, political instability, economic instability, political instability. And so I always was really interested in what breaks that cycle. So can make communities, societies, whole countries better positioned to actually do better, have more opportunity for people to access, not just a small share of the population, not just people that control capital assets, but what actually leads to more opportunity. So I always sort of thought about that as more of a social activism kind of field. But I think it was really when I was studying the origins of conflict and instability that it really hit me that a big part of the story is access to assets. And that's an entrepreneurship story, right? That's a story really about who gets to start a business, who gets to take a job in a business, who gets loans for a business. And those are really intimately and almost inherently connected to things like political structure, policy, corruption, concepts like fairness and justice. And so I actually really always thought about entrepreneurship more as a tool for social and economic advancement and to pave the way to opportunity, and less as an individual business concept, if that makes any sense. So that's really where I came to entrepreneurship.
So what is the beacon on the hill that keeps you inspired, motivated, and focused on this field?
Yeah, it's the path to opportunity. So I think too much of our lives are determined by things that are out of our control. We know this. We have tons of research on this. We see this with our own eyes every day. You can be born into poverty, and then the chances are you'll stay poor. You can be born into a rich family, and the chances are you'll still have money. And so I think for me, it's really how do we make that path to opportunity, the path in particular to business ownership and entrepreneurship, something that is within reach for everybody. And I'm not saying that everyone has to start a business, but I'm saying if there is a talented person who just happened to be born in a school district that was underfunded, or happened to have parents that couldn't afford to send them to STEM camp, that child should have the same chance at really developing something incredible as an entrepreneur in the future that any other child would. Because the reality is we don't know where the next great invention is going to come from. We don't know where the next life-saving innovation is going to come from. And it's not always the people that we think are going to do the things we think.
Yeah, makes sense. And what part of the work is the most rewarding for you?
I really enjoy it when I feel like information sharing is advanced by my work. So, for example, I've been involved with some large data projects where the goal has really been to find some new avenue that we haven't actually considered. And when I see policymakers using that, that's really rewarding for me. And then obviously, I'm a professor. And so it's also really rewarding on the academic side and the teaching side when I see students really think deeply about things like access to opportunity and really think much more about what happens from an individual's birth to an individual's death, as opposed to at the age of 30, what policy matters now.
One of the biggest things I learned from your research was this idea of how we think about and count women entrepreneurs, and the fact that you have to have, quote unquote, started a business to count as an entrepreneur. What do you mean by that? What prompted you to even think about this, and what is the impact of this methodology or approach?
I think we are missing something really important when we only talk about entrepreneurs, right? Which sounds a little backwards when we say we want a better environment for entrepreneurship. Why aren't we talking more about people who aren't entrepreneurs? But I think this is actually our blind spot when it comes to all types of entrepreneurship support, whether it's at the federal policy level or it's what small business support centers are doing. And that is that by the time most people enter into our jurisdiction or purview when we are in entrepreneurship support programs, it's too late. So what I mean by that is nobody just wakes up and says, I'm going to business. And so at 9 o'clock, I'm going to go down to the business development support center or, whatever it is, the local incubator. I'm going to go and start my business. And at 10 o'clock, I will be a business owner, right? That's just not how it works. So most people take a path of some kind. Maybe it's long, maybe it's short, but most people think about starting a business. Some people will test the waters. They might talk to their friends. They might talk to their mentors. Other people might be working in a company that's in the industry that they see the opportunity in. They might talk to their colleagues at work, right? They might Google, they might even make a prototype. So there are a lot of things that people can do before we actually see them as entrepreneurs, right? And before they actually formally become entrepreneurs. So the reason I think this is a blind spot is because when we think about barriers to entrepreneurship, if we only talk to entrepreneurs, we still, of course, need to know what the challenges they face are, but we don't really have visibility into the people that never make it there. So supposing I've been thinking about starting a business for some time now, and what I find as I'm talking to people is it just is going to be very expensive to finance this business. And then I look around, I look at the numbers, maybe I talk to my local bank and I find that, I don't know, people just aren't supportive. It doesn't look like I'll get the money. It'll be 6 months before I can make a profit. In the meantime, who's going to pay my rent? So then I just don't do it. And so where would we actually find me? I wouldn't go to the incubator. I wouldn't go to the small business support center. I wouldn't be collected in the data, right? Because the data often captures people when they start a new business. But maybe I had a really promising idea. And it was really this combination of my unique personal circumstances that prevented that idea from reaching the market and from benefiting broader society, right? So I think one thing that we really need to think about is who are the group of people for whom barriers to starting a business were actually existential and they never actually got to start. Obviously, there's huge economic consequences. There's social and welfare consequences. But just think about this. And these people, you could call them withdrawn entrepreneurs, which is what a big project that NORC has recently released calls them. I've done some work on them, calling them pre-entrepreneurship leavers. Some people might call them lost entrepreneurs, potential entrepreneurs. We're referring to a group of people that was interested in starting a business, took some action along the way, but ultimately withdrew from the process before start. In the United States, that can range. So depending on where you are, it could be 5 to 16% of the population, right? And that's actually a really large number. So I looked up a couple of states before we chatted, and in Kansas, where I used to live, 16% of the population that was surveyed was withdrawn. And so what this means is that these are people who could have started a business, but didn't. In Illinois, not far behind, about 15%. Indiana, where I live and work, it was about 12%. And some places will surprise you. So in California, which we think of as a hotbed for entrepreneurship, it was about 10%. So that means 1 in 10 people walking around in the adult population isn't starting a business, but wanted to and even took some steps to. It's more interesting when we compare this with the current business owners. So if we go back to Kansas, 14% of the population are current business owners. 16% are withdrawn. When we look at Indiana, 13% are current business owners, 12% are withdrawn. So we're talking potentially about doubling business owners in a state like Indiana. if all the people who withdrew before they started actually continued. Now, the big caveat is it isn't necessarily that everyone who stopped the process would have done well and should have continued. So sometimes people withdraw from the process because they do some background research, or they do a prototype, or they talk to their contacts and they make a decision. This is actually not a good, viable idea, right? So in those cases, of course, we're not talking about the same thing as when someone is withdrawing because they keep getting doors slammed in their face when they go to ask for loans, right? When we think about the cost for us in the aggregate, it's actually tremendous. I think the other thing that's really interesting about this group of withdrawn entrepreneurs is we still have very little insight into who they are and what they do. As far as data, that's not something we've been collecting over 30 or 40 years. And it's also not a question that we're in the habit of asking. So when we say we want to support entrepreneurs, we usually go to entrepreneurs or people who are still in the process and ask them what they need. And I'm not saying that this should replace that, but I think in addition to that, we need to understand who these people are that are dropping out of the process. And if the barriers that are forcing them to drop out of the process are artificial, structural, and can be addressed by some targeted support.
And that brings up a couple of really interesting questions, right? You talked about the fact that there's not going to be 100% conversion of these pre-entrepreneurial folks. To what extent do you think it's fair to say that it's really the quality of the entrepreneur that drives the process? Because I can always throw away one idea and come up with a different idea if I had the right access to resources. Do you have a take on that based on everything you've seen?
I mean, I have an intellectual take on it, not a practical one. It's a classic debate, right? Is entrepreneurship a person? Is entrepreneurship a process? Is it an employee? Is it a way of thinking? Certainly, we know that people are entrepreneurial. So there are people who can problem solve. There are people who see opportunities, but does it mean you have to start a business? I don't know. The way that I approach it is that entrepreneurship has to be some combination of behavior and action. It's a really interesting question. We could spend hours debating whether someone can be entrepreneurial if they haven't started a business, right?
Good point. Well taken. What do we know about pre-entrepreneurs? Do we know what draws them into entrepreneurship? And can you draw any inferences based on what that means for lost opportunity and for these people?
One thing that's quite interesting is the numbers, particularly among women and men, might be surprising. So they're very interesting gender dynamics. Again, I'll take the example of Indiana here. So among current business owners, for example, we see that about 57% in recent data, I think, were women. And we see also a very similar trend among withdrawn entrepreneurs. But it is interesting. So I think a lot of people would be surprised when they find out that 57% of current business owners in Indiana are women. And so when we see that number among the withdrawn entrepreneurs, we want to also be thinking about how these numbers look together. In Illinois, we see that about 4 in 10 business owners are women, and a little over 5 in 10 withdrawn entrepreneurs are women. I think we want to pay attention not only to who's dropping out, but who actually makes it into the process, right? Because that tells us a little bit about what happens in terms of the process. The other thing that I think is really interesting is nationally, across age groups, women tend to withdraw from the process more than men. And it's over 50% across the age groups. So I always find that interesting because I've seen a lot of interest in entrepreneurship by age, for example, and particularly among those that are 18 to 29, less than or right around 35% of people in that age group that withdraw are men. And so that leaves a very large share that are women. And that is actually surprising. It really surprises me as well, because I would expect to see numbers closer to 50% or a 48-52 kind of split. The other thing that's really interesting too is that people withdraw from the process for a lot of reasons, some that are not surprising and some that are actually quite surprising or maybe more multi-layered than we think. For example, women are more likely than men to report lack of time as an important reason. They both report lack of time, but women are more likely to report lack of time. I don't think the conclusion that we make from that is, well, women just don't have enough time because they can't make time, right? I think there are some pretty obvious next questions that we need to ask when we hear that women are more likely to say that lack of time is a barrier to continuing the process than men. And so the why really matters. The other thing that I find really interesting is that when it comes to promotion at work, which was one of the report in recent NORC survey that I looked up this data on, one of the reasons you could report was promotion at work, and men are more likely to report that a promotion at work. Not by a lot, actually it's close to 50-50, but that split is much different than what we see with lack of time. Similarly, lack of finance, it is not surprising that women are more likely to report lack of finance as a reason they withdrew from the process. Too risky, potential lost focus, lack of support, major life event. Those are all reasons that people withdraw from the journey, and also reasons where we see that women are more likely to report than men.
So this brings up an almost an intractable question of how do you get them? What are some promising seeds that we could look at to bring more of these, especially women, into the fold and perhaps get a greater yield of entrepreneurs from that set?
I think the first thing is most of what we do at the program and policy support level is targeting people who have already made it past quite a few humps, right? So starting earlier in the process and getting people on the path earlier and keeping them there, I think is a really big opportunity, especially when you're looking at numbers like the numbers we see in Indiana, right? And I think a lot of that is tied to things that are not specifically about entrepreneurship. So when we look at lack of finance, right, that's really a question about fairness in financial markets. And that's really a question we already have a lot of answers to. So we know a lot about gender discrimination in financial markets. We know a lot about the experience of women in accessing funding, whether it is loans from banks, whether it is venture capital, whether it is entering into the angel market, whether it is looking for financing from their personal social networks. We actually have a lot that we already know about that. I think we want to think more in terms of what are the pieces of the puzzle that form that part of the journey that is not quite visible to us, that pre-start piece of the journey. We also know that having access to good mentors and having access to role models has been really important, and not only for entrepreneurship, for a lot of things. And so I think about young girls, say in 6th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade, having access to mentors and role models, right? So I think there's a lot we can do in terms of programming, in terms of social media. We have really great technology now. So when I was in 6th grade, we didn't have things like virtual reality to try to see what a day in the life might be like. We had the parents of our classmates come to class and tell us about their jobs. That was the extent of role modeling and career exploration for us at that young age. Now you have actually a lot of technology. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. And I've heard about different programs that are really meant to share different career paths with people who might otherwise not know about them. The reality is, for most children, and I'm not a researcher on children at all, so this is my take on the research that exists, that the reality is that for most children, what you're exposed to can be fairly limited, and technology can expand that, just as it is for adults too. So when we think about the entrepreneurship path, we want to think of it not so much as a linear path, right? But a path where there can be many obstacles, or there can be many sort of triggers that can push someone into entrepreneurship. And it's also not linear in terms of age. For example, in the United States, we see a lot of attention right now to caregiving and motherhood. And it's a mixed bag when we talk about entrepreneurship and motherhood as well. So I've heard people say things, for example, like, well, now she has young children to take care of and she can't full-time 9 to 5, or let's be honest, it's never 9 to 5, but she can't commit to full-time work. And so she can start a business. She should be an entrepreneur. And it's not that simple. So I think we also need to sort of rethink the idea that entrepreneurs have to be of a certain age, of a certain look, and make it accessible at all stages in the journey, right? And so if you're 40 or if you're 18 and you're a woman and you think you have a really good idea, what can we do that would basically not discourage you from pushing that idea forward? Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And it leads me to my next question, which is, You talked about on ramps and off ramps, and I want to talk about off ramps to begin with, because the easiest way is to people are already considering entrepreneurship. How do we keep them rather than get off the ramp? In this pre-entrepreneurship stage, what do women typically do? And which of those are the biggest off ramps? Do you have any data from your research on that?
So there's a couple of different sources for data on this. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is, in some ways, there aren't very many differences between what men and women are doing, with a few exceptions, right? And it seems to be always like this with entrepreneurship. So one of the things in some research that I did with a colleague when I was at the Kauffman Foundation, in terms of things like market research, talking to people, consulting experts, there weren't massive differences between men and women. But in other ways, there were. So, for example, learning about financing options outside of personal sources, we saw some difference there. Discussing the ideas and who you discuss the ideas with, we saw some differences there. I think it's probably worthwhile from an entrepreneurship support perspective for us to really think about not only what the steps are that women are taking, but also what the broader cultural and social environment is, right? Because almost everything points to these levers that are cultural and social.
So if you had to wave a magic wand, for example, and say, and I'm going to zero in on the finance piece that you said was different, what would have to be different for us to be able to have a different tone of conversation with these women that help them see paths to entrepreneurship that they're saying today there isn't?
We're seeing that to some extent, although I've seen some mixed findings from the last couple of years, but more representation, right? It's a really, really important thing for women to also be in decision-making roles and to be in positions of power where they are making decisions about who gets funded. They're thinking about markets as part of a team that is making decisions. We see that when we have more representation, we see better decision-making. Women-owned firms and men-owned firms have very different pathways in terms of financing, but in many cases, these pathways don't actually have to be different, right? And so the questions that women are asked during the financing process and the questions men are asked during the financing process don't have to be different. And so I think that just having more women in financing on the other side, so not only having more female founders, but having more women that are in meetings saying, we're going to look at it this way, right? Talking about what the benefits would be from other perspectives that maybe you wouldn't think about would go a long way. And that I see as sort of a systemic effort that we're seeing in banking, we're seeing in the venture finance world. It's happening, but it's frustratingly slow. And sometimes the things that we think will work don't. And, you see really interesting grassroots new financial models developing all over the place. And I think that's really promising. But it's not a matter of saying we need more women to start businesses. And sometimes as we say, we need more women to start businesses. And so let's set a goal of 500 women, or let's set a goal of 50 women. Asking women to start businesses in an environment where they're going to face barriers in financial markets, where their businesses are going to grow to a certain point, and then getting that last round is also difficult to do. So I think we need to think both about, is the ecosystem supportive, and can we show women that the ecosystem is supportive so that they are willing to start those businesses? It's never lack of ideas. It's never lack of talent, skill, interest, or ability. It's the other things.
So we talked about access to finance, or at least perceptions of access to finance, but there's also the question of all the other stuff in terms of a path to a viable firm. What do women need to see that they're not seeing today that would help them get over the hump? And what can existing infrastructures such as incubators or what have you do to help get them over the hump that isn't happening today?
So I think those are basically two questions, right? So one is really one about, do we create a welcoming environment, an inclusive environment for women entrepreneurs? And then I think the second is, do we actually treat the whole person when we are trying to provide entrepreneurship support? I think we know what to do. We just haven't done it, right? So we need to reduce barriers. We certainly need to see more representation of women. We also need to make things more friendly to women, knowing the other types of concerns that women are dealing with. And that really means supporting the person. there's actually a program that I think is really great. It's the Center for Women in Enterprise. They have offices in Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. And even in the way they describe their mission, it's very clear that they are talking about economic empowerment. It's an inclusive economic empowerment organization. And so what they're really talking about is the whole of the person. And so that's where I think it's almost a missed opportunity for incubators and for accelerators as well, but certainly for incubators, is to really only look at the business or to really only look at the business related dimensions of the person. But there is so much more to what goes into a decision to start a business. We have data on the reasons that people even are interested in starting a business, and then the reasons they drop out of the process. And I'm not saying that entrepreneurship support programs should be doing things like, family interventions or anything like that. But I do think that many of the barriers that emerge for women are emerging at the family level, the household level, the individual level, the societal level. And so those are barriers that are just really difficult for an incubator to assess and address if they're not looking for them. If it's only about the bottom line and there weren't any other barriers, we wouldn't see all this concern about why women aren't starting businesses, right? We just wouldn't. And so I think taking the approach of what is right for the person makes the most sense. In some cases, it may not be starting a business. In some cases, it might be wage employment, or it might be waiting to start a business, or it might be starting a business. And I think taking into account what a person's goals are and the reason for starting the business is really crucial.
It's almost arguing for the right metaphor for an incubator. It's like an egg laying mechanism, I guess, which is a pre-incubator that says, hey, woman, come in. Here's what your economic goals and aspirations are.
Yeah.
Here are your paths. And if this is one of them, let's help you understand and flesh out how good of a fit entrepreneurship is. And we'll send you off to an incubator. And if not, we'll send you off some other path. But a pre-stage, almost like a prequel to an incubator is kind of what I'm hearing you talk about. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, that's absolutely fair. And I think we have to stop thinking about entrepreneurship success at the program level. So among incubators and among policies and things like that, as the number of new businesses that are started, or the number of women that start new businesses, right? We certainly saw this during COVID, is many people started businesses out of necessity, right? They had to. And sometimes those businesses are good stopgaps, but when the economy bounces back and the job market looks good again, they may move back into employment. I think thinking about entrepreneurship as less of the outcome and as more of a process and state that people can select into or choose into in order to meet their needs and their goals is a really good way to think about it. As real economic empowerment means, as a woman, right, that I can choose whether or not maximizing my goals is through starting a business. And the practical reality is maybe it is, maybe it's not. And coming to that answer is something that I think is a huge opportunity for entrepreneurship support to be more effective.
Excellent. That's very
helpful. I love your idea of a pre-incubator.
Okay, I'll put it down and see if we can do something about it. Thanks. Coming from an academic, that does mean a lot. Thank you for that. So what I'm hearing you say is really, let's first help you figure out if this is the right tool, the right vehicle for you to realize whatever aspirations you have that have an economic outcome. And then if it is, then let's make it as easy as it is for men and not add all these extra barriers for you to get over.
By the way, it's not just for women, right? I mean, we're talking about women because that's what we care about. But, this is really important for men too. I think we have this narrative in America about entrepreneurship being this sort of end goal, and it's really amazing. And it is in many, many ways. I'm not doubting that or questioning that. The data does tell us, though, that some share of the population turn to entrepreneurship because they don't have any other choices. And for that share of the population, I think we really need to think about, can entrepreneurship work, right? How do we make it work better? Or was this really your only choice? And is there a way to expand your choice set?
Got it. But just to play devil's advocate for a little bit, my response to that would be, if you've already made the choice, the first thing that we can do to make your life easier is to make sure your odds of success are as high as possible so that you have earned the cash cushion and the economic resources to then take a step back and say, okay, is this still the right answer? So regardless of what that choice would have been, it still feels to me like making entrepreneurship easier and her odds of success higher is a no regret move. And we have to be doing that.
Yes.
So
easier to get in and easier to get out.
Yeah, agreed. So then one other thing, I want to go back to that research. I was reading this paper and you talked about this big difference between men and women who are thinking about starting a business. And in that report, you mentioned that 3 times as many women were put off, and I think I'm quoting you, by a lack of perceived inclusion as compared to aspiring male entrepreneurs. Now, to me, that's a huge bombshell. What are these perceived barriers of inclusion? How do they show up in the path of a woman who's considering entrepreneurship?
This is where I think, we really underestimate the importance of social and cultural factors and the broader environment. And I have to check which report you're talking about, because there are a couple that have looked at this in the last few years. But, typically what we'll see is women, for example, walking into a room and seeing no other faces that look like them, right? That's why inclusion matters. It doesn't mean that everyone else in the room is going to be hostile. It's not so much that, and certainly it could be that. But what I hear a lot about is relatability, is understanding and having some shared knowledge about things like the industry, the product, from the perspective of someone who goes through the same experiences that a woman is going through, or that particular woman is going through. That also, I think, points to, again, it not often being things like, I'm not smart enough, or I don't have a good enough idea, or there isn't a big enough market, right? But it's really this idea that I have to walk into a room and find suppliers or find customers. And this idea of kind of walking into the old boys network, it just makes things harder. It's difficult to identify all of the social, cultural, sometimes regional factors that will kind of shape that inclusion in the environment. Some of it is very tangible. So things like where business decisions are made, who's in the room when there are networking events, where networking takes place, right? Those are pretty tangible. And then others are, again, things like, are there people that have had your same experience or that have been in a similar position that are going to be in the room when you're pitching for funding? So inclusion really is about creating or enabling a more supportive environment that is welcoming of everybody. And so that's where I think we'll have a long way to go for women. You hear it anecdotally all the time. And so that's where I think there's really a role for entrepreneurship support programs as well, is to, again, ask about the things that we don't see in business plans or we don't see in financial statements, right? But things like social support, engagement, inclusion.
So I heard loud and clear representation is important because it has so many downstream implications on what a woman feels like about taking the step into entrepreneurship. There's representation. There's also a piece around process in terms of what does the process of learning about entrepreneurship and engaging in those first few steps look like, and how well are they fitted to how a woman thinks about it and what issues she's facing. Are there other dimensions that you can put in a box and say, change this, and this, that an incubator or an organization can take away as a to-do list?
Yes and no. I think going back to the motherhood example, right? So I had never really thought about motherhood as a major economic event, as, say, a young person, or, even doing my training, because I was solidly really focused on policy. And I had a colleague, her name's Jessica Liu. She's absolutely brilliant. She had done a lot of work on motherhood. And we had a few conversations where I was thinking, do we need to think about unique situations when we're looking at the aggregate? And Jessica would look at me and sort of think, how can you not think that, right? And what I learned from her really blew me away. When we think about things like the intersection between a business and economic decision and a personal and family decision, that intersection is actually much larger and much more sort of all-encompassing than we think, right? So caregiving is a really big constraint. It's a constraint in the labor market. It's a constraint for manufacturing firms to hire. It's a constraint for entrepreneurs. Just because you start your own business and you can work from home with your computer does not mean that caregiving stops becoming a problem. Small children in particular, and we know that women spend disproportionately more time on care, but your small children in particular are still going to be screaming whether or not you're taking your Zoom call at your kitchen table or in your office 2 miles away, right? So I think the caregiving problem is one that we really, really need to consider from a support perspective. And incubators, I think, should be very seriously thinking about this question also as a business opportunity. Not only are the female founders that are coming in as part of the teams or single founders, solo founders coming in to the incubators as potential investments, but they are going to be affected by their caregiving status. Their resources are going to be constrained by their caregiving status. I think it's something we need to think about, and we need to stop thinking about that as a family problem or a household problem. So we've seen firms start offering caregiving resources to keep workers in. And so similarly, I think we need to think about keeping people on the path to entrepreneurship with a caregiving component. I don't know how that would look or how that would work, but it's definitely a barrier, and we see it again and again. It's also a huge opportunity. So we talk often about the demand for caregiving. So caregiving is really expensive, and here's how much people are spending on it. There's also a supply problem, right? And so I think there's an opportunity to seed more caregiving facilities. Is it going to be the massive venture style return that you would get if you were investing in a high-tech firm? No, probably not. But there's also a lot of opportunity there, I think, in really rethinking how we operate caregiving as an industry, because it is inherently holding back entrepreneurs and it is holding back competitiveness. So it's a collective problem, and people who think entrepreneurially can probably solve it, right? That's what they do.
So you talked about representation, we talked about caregiving. Are there other ways in which the entrepreneurial ecosystem, particularly incubators and what I'll call the point of first contact, so maybe university programs and stuff like that, what else can they be doing to get women earlier in the pipeline to even consider it for longer periods of time or take more actions that are consistent with starting something entrepreneurial?
Yeah. We see a lot of success. I mean, I don't want to, for example, boast about my own university, but Indiana University has a great entrepreneurship program. So this is definitely happening. But spreading entrepreneurship as a concept, as a theme, as something that people need to learn to be good at, regardless of whether they're going to start a business or not. What I mean by that is across universities, schools that are not business schools have entrepreneurship curriculum, right? They take core courses now, or they offer core courses now at a lot of universities. And I think that can be particularly effective, because if you're trained, for example, in music, you're learning all of the sophisticated fine art, gosh, any profession, right? There is a point at which being an entrepreneur in that field may actually be the right path for you. So you're in dental school, you're going to open your own practice, your own clinic. It would be a lot easier if you had some skills that you learned that would help you actually manage that clinic, right? If you are studying music and at some point part of your income portfolio or part of what you do is opening a school for music or giving lessons, I think this idea that entrepreneurship is not only starting a business, but really is the whole of the person engaging in something is really meaningful. And so to get people in earlier, we need to raise the idea earlier. We need to teach the skills to recognize opportunity, to think creatively, to innovate, to put together resources at a much younger age. And that is happening, and that seems to be working.
I love this idea that you bring up, because what it's telling me is that you're teaching entrepreneurship in generally and thinking as a business person specifically as a capability that anybody in any profession has. And the specialist in entrepreneurship is actually going to make that their whole life, so to speak, and say, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to start a business.
I mean, I think everyone should have those basic skills. I'm not in a business school, I'm in a policy school, so I don't teach any of these things. But I think there are people who want to open a business, who know that that is their path. They will be business owners. They're going to open a very successful business and they'll figure out how to do it. But I also think that we see a lot of people who maybe never had the goal of starting a business. They had the goal of becoming an expert violinist, working in advertising, getting an advertising degree, and then doing really cool creative ads for nonprofits. At some point, the mode of activity for them may be being a business owner. So I don't know that everyone who starts a business, in fact, I'm sure that every business didn't always want to do that when they were children or even before they started the business. But at some point, the whole of the person assessed something and felt that starting a business was the right path. And so for those people, having some inclination about what you need, what it looks like, how it might work, some experiential education or some previous exposure, whether it's through role models or a popular narrative, gives you a greater ability to actually know what you're getting into or even consider that you could get into it.
Excellent. I love it because it gives me two things, right? What you just discussed. Number one is that there's a whole field where you actually go and teach actively a bunch of professionals. You mentioned a couple of organizations. You talked about this organization out of the Northeast that was doing the pre-incubation stuff. But are there other entrepreneur support organizations that you see who have adopted good models that are doing more of the stuff that you just talked about? And would you just discuss their models briefly?
So I think that one does a really, really nice job. And I really like the approach of the whole of the person. And it comes across, I mean, you can see even from the way that the organization is staffed, that it's not quote unquote only business support. It's inclusive economic empowerment. And that includes business support, but that also includes thinking about a lot of other things. Look, I'm a little bit biased. I'll say that up front. I think the Kaufman Foundation, it is an organization that has really thought very deeply about what entrepreneurship means. And I think that some of the work that the foundation does is really meaningful, really kind of thinking through barriers, particularly that might exist across social groups, across demographic groups. That is very promising. I, of course, am a big fan of the research work because I led the research strategy for some time there. But on the programmatic side, I find the work that Kaufman has been doing is really groundbreaking. And you see the investments pay off over time. So things that the foundation did, decades ago, make so much of an impact. And now it seems obvious to us, right? Because we've seen it for some time. But I think that foundation in particular has done some really groundbreaking support work and has seeded some things that are just things that have fundamentally changed the way we think about entrepreneurship. So again, I will fully admit, very biased opinion, but really great entrepreneurship support work.
Moving on to a slightly different topic. A big part of entrepreneurship support, you mentioned this a couple of times in our conversation, is this role that mentors and peer networks have on your development as an entrepreneur. What challenges do you see in how mentorship is provided today to women and women of color in the entrepreneurial process?
I think we have a representation issue, even though the data from Indiana tells us that the majority of women of entrepreneurs are women. We also know that there are some really sort of clear industry and firm success, firm growth, firm size distinctions as well. And so with mentoring, it really is about the two components of entrepreneurship again, right? So you've got like the business and the industry and the things that we typically think about. And then you've got the walking through the experience piece, right? That social, cultural, personal piece that can be unique to each person. But we also have a challenge around this idea that entrepreneurship is only a business question, right? And the reason I say that is that when you look at why people seek business advice or mentoring, so this is some work that the Kaufman Foundation actually did that I think is really great. Half of employer business owners didn't even seek business advice or mentoring. So one of the things is really getting people to understand what the benefits are of doing that. So of course you want mentors to commit, but also getting people to understand, hey, there is something really tangible and something of value that I can get from this, right? And so those types of programs can be really, really important. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was the reasons that people who sought mentoring actually did. For example, taxes and accounting, legal advice, and how to grow sales, right? And so I think when we think about, again, entrepreneurship and mentoring in entrepreneurship, we're still often strictly thinking about it as a business question and less of a sort of coaching, personal engagement type of question. And when it comes to the sources of mentoring too, we saw again, this is some data that the Kauffman Foundation has shared out, that the sources of mentoring can vary significantly. And so there are people that are seeking mentoring largely from colleagues or from family. And so is that mentoring? Is it social emotional support? So I think we want to be a little bit more careful about structured mentoring programs and what type of communication or what type of signal we are sending, particularly to women entrepreneurs, about what they offer. And maybe also think about this idea that you need all of the things that mentoring programs do, and not a but, not an or, but an and. There are other shared experiences that people may need to talk about, or that they may need to have access to mentors to sort of work through.
Got it. And you touched on one thing, which is like this question of imbalance between demand and supply. I think there's a lot more people who might want the mentoring than there are suitable people who are willing and available to provide it. So outside of the fact that there is an imbalance, have you seen models that work or that somehow get over this supply-demand problem, or that somehow improve the situation especially for women entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so I won't say get over, but I think technology has just been incredible, because before you were able to set people up with mentors over the internet and have digital meetings and things like that, you had to have them within a certain geography around you, right? And that would make inclusion in particular geographies especially sticky and hard to change, right? So you'd be sort of caught in a not enough mentors, need more mentors, not enough mentors, need more mentors. But some of these online platforms have reshaped the way we have access to potential mentors. I think we've also had enough of a sort of systematic approach to mentoring programs to have identified things like best practices, what actually works the best in terms of firm performance, what kind of impact we might see from, for example, more frequent mentor meetings, or having a very specific type of agenda for mentoring. So there's quite a bit there, but technology has been, in my opinion, a game changer, not just for mentoring, but also for some of the things we talked about before, like role models, access to even just think about it. You only know what you're exposed to or what you know. And so particularly for young girls who come from disadvantaged backgrounds or communities where they don't see role models, right? Or innovation. And I think technology just has really made it so that we can deliver so much more information and so much more content and opportunity to be inspired and to think beyond what you can see only in front of you, which is what it was like 20 years ago for most people, right? So
we talked about mentoring specifically, but there's a related but separate issue, which is access to networks. So to what extent are you seeing that to be a challenge in the data for women entrepreneurs? And is there anything else you'd add in terms of what could be made better? What solutions would need to be in place that would be unique to the challenges women face?
The access to networks piece is really important, because anytime that you can grow those networks, you're also increasing the chances that you're growing other things, right? So bigger networks that have more women in them also means more potential mentors, more potential relationships. The thing we have to be careful about with mentoring in particular, and where I think access to networks can really be helpful, is you're the only woman or one of few women on a team, right? And so then you're asked to do the things that would advance opportunities for women. And of course, that is very important and you want to, but then that's extra work, right? And you already have other things. And so we want to also be mindful of those types of things when we set up mentoring programs. Access to networks, I think it's almost like you can never go wrong, because you're just increasing the density and the depth of networks. You're making things more accessible to people. I think anytime you create more points of interface and interaction where information can flow, the better, right? Because the more information people can have access to, the more they'll learn about things like access to capital, potential suppliers, potential consumers, markets. Access to networks, in my opinion, is almost like it can't go wrong.
And have you seen any innovative, effective, new approaches to increasing that access, particularly to women entrepreneurs and potential women entrepreneurs, because that's where they're getting the information from on what is involved in entrepreneurship and what their odds of success are?
Yeah, we are on the right track. I just think we need to start earlier. I think part of what we're looking at is when we build relationships and we sort of make sure that information flow starts at a younger age, then we see more opportunities for all of the other things that come out of access to networks. For example, networking events are a common thing. And is that the right way to do it? I'm not sure. I don't have the data on that. So it's very hard for me to say yes or no. But with COVID and particularly so much of what we did going online and becoming tech-based, there are a lot of really interesting opportunities there to expand access to networks, right? So again, you can have virtual networking events. You don't have to be in the room at the Chamber of Commerce at the time that they're hosting the event at 8 p.m. when you can't find childcare, right? So I think this unique relationship between networks and information flow is really, really important. But that's this is what you work on, right? So you're talking a lot about that. So you're the expert on that.
I wouldn't call myself the expert, but definitely it's on my radar, particularly the role models, the representation, and the access to networks is a big part of what I do and why I do what I do. So that is definitely on point. So taking a big step back, right? What are your thoughts on how we can improve the outlook for women earlier in the game so that they have more exposure, more affinity, and more opportunity to pursue careers in STEM that will then lead to more downstream entrepreneurial activity?
ASU is doing some really interesting stuff on engineering education in particular. And so many schools are doing a lot, really sort of understanding the reality that you have to make engineering education more inclusive, more tangible to people, and really sort of rooted in what people are seeing and what kind of problems they want to solve. I think what we're seeing, particularly around things like training, again, there are huge opportunities for commercialization of science, right? There are huge opportunities to take something that you've been working on, you've developed as an engineer, or that you've considered, right? You've seen an opportunity for, and to commercialize that. And so that's why I think things like experiential education really matter, but also the idea that teaching skills to people across fields, not only in business schools, but in engineering schools, in high schools, right? How do you solve a problem? How do you put resources together? Those things are really, really important. We can teach about creating a product. We can teach about making things, but then the next step, which is how do I commercialize this? How do I bring this to the market? Product development, getting financing. Those are all problems that you can solve. So I think really kind of almost like democratizing entrepreneurial education is probably one of the most promising things we can do, particularly with STEM, right?
Got it. So there are a couple of big takeaways that are all coalescing for me from this conversation. Number one is that it needs to be a more holistic view of, or even a definition of what entrepreneurship even means and who that is appropriate for. That was my big takeaway. The second thing is the fact that following that, you need to be able to disseminate that information or make that accessible to a much broader set of individuals than we are making today, regardless of gender, discipline, and stuff like that. And number three, to me, most importantly, the big takeaway was that really a lot of this is a top down, and there's not a lot that individual women can do beyond what they're already doing to make the environment more favorable to their own efforts. What's your take on the last one?
The last one is hard because look, women start businesses every day and do exceptionally well, right? And so it's not a situation where we're saying don't start a business because the cards are all stacked against you and, it's going to be really tough. So just don't do it. Save yourself the heartache. That's not at all the case. I think what we have to acknowledge is that it is easier for some women. So it is easier for some women to start a business than others. Access to resources and your starting point, if you would like to put it like that, matter quite a bit. Easier for some women to grow a business than others. When we look at the numbers overall, these systematic patterns that show differences between men and women in industry and firm performance and access to capital, those are concerning. We can't pretend they don't exist. The way that we have more role models is more women starting businesses and doing exceptionally well. The fact is the ecosystem for entrepreneurship doesn't favor women and creates significant barriers. So I don't know that it's let's throw the whole thing out and wait until we have a perfect situation for women to start their businesses. we've made some progress and we just need to get better at creating an inclusive environment. And it's not saying that, hey, now we've got to redesign everything to be really great for women. It's really thinking about what are the things that are holding women back, right? Because they're also, in a lot of ways, holding everyone back.
So to conclude then, if I'm a woman, I understand all of the realities that you just laid out. What advice or guidance would you give as an academic, as somebody who sees the big picture that's very grounded in data, to give myself the best shot at success?
I should not be giving anyone advice. You should be giving the advice. But if I were to think sort of more generally about, for me, the big lesson, right, is in my own work. The question that I ask myself a lot is, what is holding back? What is holding the individual back from the freedom to pursue the economic future that is the best for them? I think thinking in terms of what is the whole person going to benefit from if I take this path or if I take that path is really, really important. And so I think questions like viability, happiness, those are questions that really should factor into any individual's decision about whether or not pursuing business ownership is the right path for them, right? And if it is, then obviously finding the right match with entrepreneurship support programs is crucial and really matters.
Great. Thank you. Is there any question that I should have asked you and I didn't?
No. No. I've listened to some of your previous podcasts, and it's fascinating how much one person's experience can teach you, right? So I've listened to a couple of them, and I've just been blown away by what I've learned just from even one person talking about the path that they've taken, right? And that's why I think it's so important to have podcasts like this, because somebody somewhere is going to be listening to a story that, a woman is telling about her own experience and how she did something. And just even hearing that opens up your world, right?
Thank you. I love that.
You for doing this.
I love it.
You're really doing a big service.
Thank you. That is my ulterior goal, is to make sure that we're showcasing a lot more women role models and experts like yourself, so that somebody who's going in gets the best possible shot at knowing what she needs to know, learning what she needs to learn, understanding how others have solved this problem before. So on that note, I want to say thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. And I think it's really important for folks like us, current and aspiring entrepreneurs, to not only hear from others who are role models, but also to hear from people who view this in a much more objective, big picture level, so that we understand the system that we're dealing with. So I want to thank you for your time and for sharing your insights so generously.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a real honor.
Someone once told me you can't read the label if you're inside the bottle. Yes, it's important to take action and not drown in analysis paralysis, but it's also foolish to ignore the wisdom to be gained by objective observers. This conversation with Sameeksha opened my eyes in so many ways. While it may not give you the 3 tools of successful entrepreneurship, it offers powerful insights that may help you move the needle and create impact in many more ways than you can imagine, or maybe you will ever know. First and foremost, how many potential women entrepreneurs are we losing before they ever step into an incubator or register their LLC? As entrepreneurs ourselves, even if we've not made millions, can we be sharper observers in our own neck of the woods and offer a helping hand or a hard-won perspective to someone considering that step? Second, how can we be mentors and role models to the girls and young women in our own circles? Yes, self-promotion and driving visibility for your own work feels uncomfortable. But would you take on that challenge if it meant to open up a new possible future for even one young woman or girl? Do it for her, if not for you. Last but not least, it's all about STEM. The actual content of a STEM education may or may not matter, but giving access and encouragement to women to pursue STEM fields is absolutely critical to building a pipeline of future successful women entrepreneurs. So, what one small step will you take to be a nudge, a possibility, or a light of inspiration to a future entrepreneur? Thanks for listening to today's episode. We have show notes and more at achieve.co. That's achieve.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe and share with a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go be an achiever.